All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology. I'm your host, Doug, and today we are going to be having the Sony Nex 6 versus the Sony Nex 7. It's actually called the Alpha Nex, but anyways. But I'm also going to be throwing two other cameras into the mix here. One camera will be the Fuji, the X-E1. The other one will be the Fuji X Pro 1. Now, my reasoning for doing this is because of the fact that as far as the setup for this segment goes, this is going to be very different from the other segments that I've actually done in the past. To begin with, you're talking about the mirrorless camera concept, and that's what we're evaluating today, is the mirrorless camera concept. But we're also wanting to look at cameras that actually reflect themselves as SLRs in terms of how they're actually used from an ergonomical point of view. Now, for those of you who know, you can't really have an SLR without a viewfinder. So that kind of just wipes out quite a few of the cameras that we could be looking at for this setup. Also, the Sony Nex 6 just came out. So there's been a lot of buzz about it. A lot of people have said it gives stellar images, and also they say that they've made a lot of corrections in terms of the ergonomics, and they've given it a little bit of a better menu system and things of that nature. Price-wise, this camera rings in at a rough I want to say $850. Now, the Nex 7, when it debuted at about $1350. Now, the Nex 7 is considered to be a professional line compact SLR. Now, the reason why I brought the Fujis into it was because just comparing a Nex 6 to a Nex 7 really didn't do anything for me. And I thought that it would make more sense if we took another Pro line series of mirrorless cameras, which is the Fuji, and make the comparison that way. As far as the cameras are going to go, all of the images have been interpolated to 24 megapixels. So this will not be a case where we have dragged down the resolution aspects of the Sony Nex 7, which rings in at a 24 megapixels and which does have a larger sensor than the other cameras being displayed here today. But what we did is we bolstered the resolution of the other cameras through a form of interpolation to be able to go up against the Nex 7 in a fair aspect. Now, when you're looking at when you're looking at Sony and when you're looking at Fuji, you are looking at two very different concepts in terms of camera creation. Sony at this point in time is all about speed, and they're also about having a shooting experience that drives home with the concept of speed. Where Fuji is about camera intelligence, and they're about functionality, and they're about precision. Now, both experiences will give you very, very different experiences from the standpoint of where the manufacturers are coming from. So to give you an example here, as you watch this video, you're going to notice that the Sony's dynamic range is drastically inferior to Fuji's dynamic range. I mean, there is no two ways about this. If you're trying to compare the Fuji to the Sony, and if you're trying to talk about Sony's dynamic range compared to Fuji's, it's like a night and day difference. Now, I do want to note that Sony actually supplies Nikon with their sensors, so when you're looking at some of my Nikon reviews and you're like, man, dude, these Nikons suck. Why are these things so terrible in their dynamic range and coloring and whatnot? Keep in mind, they get a lot of their stuff from Sony. Now, Nikon doesn't get everything from Sony, and I want to make that clear. They've started to move towards Toshiba, and they've got some other guys in the mix I'm sure they're looking at as well. But with Fuji, like Sony, they are a sensor manufacturer, and everything is actually done in-house for them. Or so far it's been done in-house. In past, they've actually leased out the concept of their bodies to Nikon, so on and so forth, in their previous SLR days. But now Fuji has come home to keep it all in the home, and I think they are looking to lease out to Zeiss to have futuristic lenses done for them. Now, this is interesting because the Sony series actually does use Zeiss lenses as well. So the comparison that we're actually making here is very important. But now what we're going to do is get down to the nuts and bolts of the camera. The images, obviously, you're going to pick that up as you look at the images for what they are. But let's just get down to the nuts and bolts of how Fuji makes their cameras and how Sony makes their cameras. The first thing is going to be speed. Sony is going to tout that their camera can do 10 to 12 frames a second. I believe the Nex 7 actually does 12 frames a second. The Nex 6 does 10 frames a second at its full resolutions. Now, keep in mind, the Nex 6 is only 16 megapixels. The Nex 7 is the one that's 24 megapixels. The Fujis are both 16 megapixels. The Fujis, in terms of their frame per second, are only going to be 6 frames per second. But there's another way in which you have to judge speed. And the speed actually comes down to autofocusing. The way it works with the Fuji, with its kit lens, it will auto speed at a 0.1 of a second. A 0.1. That makes it as fast as the Pentax K5 II, K5 IIs. It also makes it faster than anything from an autofocusing standpoint in the Nikon or Canon assortment, along, of course, with Sony. Sony's autofocusing is actually going to come in with the Nex 6 at about a point, we'll say 2.5-ish, around there. And the Nex 7's, its autofocusing actually does, I want to say, fluctuate. I will say, for the sake of this conversation, the Nex 7's autofocusing speed will come in at a 0.1, we'll say a 0.12, or a 0.14, around there. Okay. Now, this is provided that you're using a lens on the Nex 7 that is appropriate for its actual design. When the Nex 7 was actually debuted, it was actually debuted with the concept of a 24mm Zeiss lens. Okay, so I actually want to be fair to the Nex 7 in this conversation. Now, in this shoot, what you are going to have is you are going to have two Sigma lenses, the Sonys will be shot with the Sigma lenses, which are going to be the 70mm 2.8, macro lenses, which are excellent lenses because every other shot you guys have seen from these tests have been shot with those lenses primarily. The Fuji, I believe, is shot with a 35, and it's their own lens. So everything, once again, going to the Fuji is completely in-house, but that's how that plays out. Now, one of the key things here is the concept of the ergonomics of the camera. One of the reasons why I can actually do this review is because you are talking about optical viewfinders on both ends of each brand. So this is not a case where you buy a compact SLR and you're stuck with this screen, and of course it's noontime, the sun's blazing down on you, and you can't see what you're trying to take a picture of with full confidence. Now, there are a lot of people who will sit up here and say, oh, well, you know what, my screen works just fine outside, so on and so forth. Let's get serious here. No screen is ever going to beat out a viewfinder. It's just not going to happen from that standpoint. Now, when I say viewfinder, I'm not talking necessarily an optical viewfinder. I'm just talking about a viewfinder, period. All right? A viewfinder, which has a cover over it, does give you a better dimension of what you're taking a picture of than a 3-inch screen that has the sun beating up against it. So from that standpoint, all of these cameras are equal. Now, each of these cameras do use a different viewfinding system, which I'm not going to get into, but the viewfinding systems are adequate. If you're talking about who has the best viewfinding system, then I'm definitely going to give it over to the Fuji, the Pro, the X Pro. If I'm going to go with the second best viewfinding system, I'd actually give it to the Fuji X-E1. And I'd say the Sonys are pretty much neck and neck when it comes to the viewfinding system that you're going to be looking at there with them. So from that end, things are going to be pretty even there. Now, the next thing that I want to go through is this concept of speed and how Sony is able to utilize its speed versus Fuji and their concept of speed. So, the way it works with Sony is Sony has a much weaker dynamic range aspect to them. Part of this comes to the fact that they're using a high speed sensor with a high speed process, and they have not truly been able to capitalize on the high speed nature of what they have at this point in time in terms of image output. This is true. In the beginning, Sony had, but as of late, just about every single brand that uses a Sony sensor pretty much does a better job than Sony does, arguably. You could say that. Pentax, with their Prime 2 sensor, utterly obliterates Sony at this point in the game. Nikon, with their, with their Xpeed 3 imaging processor using the Sony sensor, there's no contest there. Okay, the Nikons are better than the Sonys if you're talking about it from noise control and things of that nature. Nikons, though, like Sonys, do suffer from the dynamic range aspect. Now, the difference between a Nikon and a Sony in terms of how they go about correcting dynamic range is the next series will have what is called an auto HDR. The way it will work is the camera will actually utilize its faster frame rate capability and take multiple shots and then slap those shots together to give you that better HDR feel if you're talking about landscapes, portraitures, or whatever you're trying to do in the form of HDR. Sony actually has a mode in their camera that will do this. So for the difference that you actually see here between the Fuji and the Sony, realize Sony does have a correction for this. The thing I have to point out to you though is this. These images were shot in RAW, which is number one. Number two, the other thing I want to point out to you is that the Fuji, in terms of its dynamic range in comparison to the Sony, is about 400 to 1600% better. And this is just in the way that their cameras perform. Now, the reason for this is Fuji is a sensor manufacturer like Sony, and Fuji does capitalize on their sensor technology. Fuji has, I want to say, in the market right now, roughly about 3 or 4 sensors within their own lineup that do excellent when it comes to dynamic range compared to their other competitors like Canon or like Nikon or anybody else that you want to throw out there. Even if you're talking about Pentax, which I am a user of Pentax and Fuji, I will be the first one to tell you that the Fuji beats the Pentax when it comes to dynamic range. Fuji was the first camera I started off with, and the reason for it was because of their coloring system, their dynamic range, and basically all of the above. There is a huge price difference between the Fujis and the Sonys. The Fuji is going to ring in at $1,400 at the baseline if you go with the EX1, or the XE1, I'm sorry, the XE1 with a lens. Realize the lens is valued at $600 though, so it's completely fair. And the Sony, of course, you can get around $850 for the camera with a 16 to 55 millimeter lens, or 50 millimeter lens. I forget which one it is, but anyways, it's within that range. The thing to keep in mind though is this: it comes down to the mechanics and the image quality and the professionalism of the photo you're going after. If you're dumping $850 into a camera system, and this is provided you lowball it and you go with the Nexus 6. Realize your dynamic range is already shot from the get-go. Okay, just starting off in this conversation. Clearly you can see how it's just not as good as what the Fuji's is. Second thing is your noise control. When you're talking about the level of noise control between the Fuji and the Fuji's noise control is better than the Canon Digix 5 processor. The Fuji Real engine that they use is way, way, way better. If you're trying to compare it to Sony's imaging processor, basically at this point in time, the Digix 4, which is comparable to Sony's, imaging processor, all right. When Canon made their jump to their Digix 5, they claimed that their system was 17 times better from Digix 4 to Digix 5. Now, I will be the first one to tell you, the Fuji's imaging processor is going to be twice as good as Canon's imaging processor. So I'm not going to necessarily say that we need to say that it's 17 times better. If we're talking Digix 4 to Digix 5, I prefer to go with the you know uh, 16 times, because I think that's more accurate based on what I've seen of it and based on what I've tested myself. But if you were comparing that to a Fuji equivalent, the Fuji equivalent would be twice as good as the Canon Digix 5 processor. That means that if you're trying to compare this Fuji to this Sony in the matchup that we have here, if we're talking imaging processor to imaging processor, the Fuji's imaging processor is like 32 times better. And that's literally why you have the difference here that you have in terms of the image quality, the noise, so on and so forth in this comparison. It's the reason why you have this giant rift between the two images. And this is why I decided to actually put the Fuji into this conversation and not just make it about, two Sonys of which Sony is the better. Because in reality, to me, both Sonys fare dismally against the Fuji. Now, I will also point out I do own a Sony NEX. And I bought it before Fuji came out with, I want to say, their X lineup. So I have to point that out too. So when you're getting this from me, understand I'm a Sony user, a Fuji user, a Pentax user. I'm fair with it all. But I will be the first one to say that the Fuji is vastly superior to the Sony if you're talking about image quality and things of that nature. Where Sony is going to try to shine through is they are going to try to shine through on the back end of the, hey, we've got 10 frames a second, or hey, we've got 12 frames a second. That's where they're going to try to push through. And to that event, they are going to fail because they simply just don't have that level of robustness in terms of autofocusing mechanics, in terms of the natural HDR, in terms of the overall clarity at the higher ISOs. Those kind of things, they're just simply going to get beat at. Really, your only saving grace would be video. If you wanted to throw video into the mix, and if you wanted to sit up here and attach a high-powered lens to this thing, then you could, take the Fuji on. Now, the thing I've got to point out is this. The Fuji, their lenses average out about 600. That's where they're at, okay? Their lenses average out about 600. The Sony, unfortunately, in order to get the image quality you're looking at here, you would have to go with their Zeiss lens, 24 millimeter. If we were talking about a NEX lens, it'd be the Zeiss lens. I think it's going to be like $1,000 plus. So realistically, looking at this, even if you go with the Fuji, the XE1 versus the Fuji X Pro, and you go with the kit lens that's on the Fuji, the kit lens on the Fuji is going to utterly obliterate anything you're going to get from Sony at this point in time in their E-mount for their NEX. It's just not going to... This is one of those cases where even if you spend less on the body, you're going to have to spend so much more on the lens to make it work that it's going to feel like it's crazy. Now, the only other redeeming value you would have in a Sony NEX, if we were making this comparison, is the fact that you can get the alpha adapter for their full frame units. Now, if you got that, that would actually correct the autofocusing issue that the NEX actually has. The problem is the adapter runs about $300 to $400, so that really doesn't help you out there from a pricing standpoint. The second thing is that you have to use normal alpha lenses after that. Now, if you're trying to use normal alpha lenses that are going to be able to compete with the Fuji lenses, I mean, at that point, you're going to be running around trying to jack yourself a Zeiss lens, like I want to say the 16 to 35. I believe it's 16 to 35. The thing runs like $2,500 to be able to compete with Fuji's kit lens quality. Understand, you may be shooting at a 2.4 the whole way through, which is true, you are. And I want to say you have different curvatures, obviously, because it's a 16 versus an 18, 35 versus a 55, so there's a different lens curvature that would play into that. But it still doesn't change the fact that you just completely lost your stabilizer because that lens adapter doesn't have a stabilizer in it. And the E-mount lenses for the NEX actually have the stabilizer built into the lens itself, which doesn't help you out any. Fuji does still retain its stabilizer, by the way. The second thing is this, is that even with that Zeiss lens that's 2500 on that $300 autofocusing adapter, whether you were to choose the Nex 7 or the Nex 6, it's still not going to beat the Fuji out in terms of low light shooting. It can't do it. It simply doesn't have the capacity to. And the autofocusing adapter will bring you to about a 0.14. That's what it's going to do. The Fuji is still a 0.1 with its kit lens. So, yeah. This is one of those cases where, seriously, if we're not talking about the video aspect, where if we're talking video, then I'll give it to the Sony over the Fuji. If you're talking about different frame rates, if you're talking about different bit rates and things like that, sure, I'll give it to them there. But if you're trying to base it off of anything else, then it's to the Fuji the whole way. And in video, by the way, the video quality of the Fuji will wipe the floor with the Sony still. It's just that the Sony's more flexible when it comes to video, and that will be its saving grace. Now, Fuji has just come out with, I want to say, their 55 to 200 millimeter lens, which is a fantastic lens. Once again, has the optical stabilizer and all that kind of fun stuff, and it's a little faster on its f-stop than other typical lenses within its range. The other thing I want to say is this, is that the Fuji's menu system actually resembles the menu system of the Sony full-size SLRs. So you have like your ISO button, your white balance, but all those kind of things, yeah, you know, that kind of stuff, yeah, you've got those things at your fingertips, where you don't have that, honestly, with the Nex within the same capacity. So, this here was just to do, a quick review, allow you guys to see, true quality compact SLRs. So you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later. All right.